I buy like, the 6-pack of readers from Amazon. So they fall apart over about 5 months, and I order them again.
It is really funny. It's especially when I talk to somebody I've known since I was like barely 22.
Yeah.
That I realize how old we are now, Pete.
Let me tell you, tonight, as we're doing this, I'm getting ready to go to my 30th high school reunion, virtually, of course, which is...
Which would have been really funny to explain to yourself 30 years ago. Let's just face that.
There is no
You're
way.
like, no way. Seriously. Yep. And you're going to have this like glass thing in your pocket that's called an iPhone.
Yeah. Right. No, it's like this is the first year, ironically, that I've been sort of excited about attending this crazy thing. And it's the first year that we're not even having it. And I'm looking at the list of people. I'm like, they're not going to remember who I am. Nobody's going to remember who I am. That's why I'm going into this, knowing that I'll be completely anonymous.
That's it.
I'm going to set the bar there. And maybe if some of my old friends show up, that'd be great. We'll see.
That would
roll
be
the
awesome.
Dice. Anyway, we're talking about Jerry and his fancy wordplay.
Yeah.
Alone becomes all one, nothing becomes no thing, and nowhere becomes now here. And I giggled over that. I know that there is actually meaning behind it in his process, but I giggled hard because he's a wordplay guy.
Yeah, that was pretty cool, right?
That's pretty good, right? I'd never, ever heard that. I'd never, ever heard that. Smart guy.
It's that cool transformation thing. Love that guy.
Yeah. You've known him for a long time. Like, how'd you feel about this conversation?
I felt great about it. Part of what I felt great about, honestly, was like, I feel like I've really absorbed Jerry Campbell beautifully for the last 20 years. Because, as I was hearing him say back to me things we've talked about for a long time, I was realizing, in the way I move through the world and the way I work with clients, his stuff is all over the place in my thinking.
Yeah.
Even in the gray sequence, for those out there who know what that is, a whole lot of his way of thinking about the world has weaved its way into that, along with a bunch of other really cool things. It's always beautiful to actually get some real time with him, though, to say, what about this? And what do you think of this? And how would you approach that? And does this metaphor work for you too? What was it like for you to listen to? That's the first time you've had a chance to talk to Jerry Campbell.
I learned a couple of things that I was able to integrate like almost immediately, apart from his charming wordplay. And I think you talked about two things. The last one I'll mention first, which was his story of training the amygdala and conquering his fear and anxiety of heights by this exercise in curiosity. And the reminder was really great because he said the amygdala does not learn through insight; it learns through experience. And
repeated experience,
like over and over and over again. And his description of like his experience parasailing and just being super curious about, why am I white knuckling the rope here? And what, I have evidence, like visual evidence, that other people are doing this and they're fine. They're surviving. Like, I don't have really, in terms of just me being, scared for my life, Mr. Amygdala, I'm doing fine. We're going to be fine. Why am I still scared of this? Like, do it again and again. That repeated experience I thought was really powerful. And I'm a needle phobia guy, so I'm like thinking, oh goodness, what am I doing with needles? Like, I try to avoid every experience that I could possibly have with needles and try to get my way around them because I don't want to deal with like passing out. And this was I started reflecting on, leaning into that experience. I have lots of opportunities to get shots and get blood draw and all this kind of stuff that if I really wanted to know what was going on with some of the, medical mystery that is Pete, I could lean into needles. Like I could say, okay, you've wanted that shot for a long time. You've wanted that blood test. Let's go do it. Let's go see what that's like. And try to allow curiosity to lead to bravery, which I thought was it was just a neat way to approach anxiety. And I talk a lot about anxiety on another podcast, so it was a neat kind of reference point for me. That was one.
There are a couple of cool things I caught in there too. I like that he had already done all this conscious stuff about getting more relaxed. You know, he's up there, he's seeing his feet dangle, and he's thinking, hey, I got this. This is fine. Everything's fine. And I thought he was going to then say, and then a gust of wind comes up and I realize I don't have this. But he didn't. He's still fine. And then he looks over at his hands and he realizes his knuckles are white and he goes, oh, all that anxiety just moved into my hands.
Yeah, right.
Hadn't noticed that. Got to do it again.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Got to do it again is not a natural response. And that is like, it's so easy at that moment to say, oh, that's where all my anxiety is. I need to go get a margarita.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
like, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to do it again. We went to Costa Rica some years ago and with the family, and we did some things that absolutely, like, white knuckle terrified me. We did the two of them that were the most substantial for me were rappelling. Now, I've rappelled before off of heights, but we were rappelling through waterfalls. Like, that was the whole gambit. Like, you go to this beautiful place and you rappel, and the water is like crushing down on you, and you got to keep your wits about you in this water as you go down through. It's the most gorgeous experience in the world, but you're stuck in the middle of the terror and the horror of the waterfall on top of you. But then it struck me, the tour takes you on like 8 of these things. And by the last one, you realize I cannot get enough of this. I have now done it 8 times. The first one was terrible. Second one was, still pretty terrible. By 3, 4, 5, you're thinking, okay, this is pretty cool. And by the end, you just want to do it again. And then we go from there to a canopy zipline tour. So we take off the side of the mountain and we're ziplining hundreds and hundreds of meters through the canopy of these trees. And it's one of those horrible things where you're ziplining and it feels like you're pretty safe. Even though you're at the top of the tree canopy, there's tree below you. And so it tricks your brain into thinking, oh, it's just a few feet down and there's tree. Of course, if you fell, you would
those
plummet
trees would tear you to
hundreds of
pieces.
feet. Yeah, you'd be torn to pieces and plummet hundreds of feet. But then the trees disappear and you are careening over a chasm. There's no tree line. And it is the most wondrous and gorgeous experience ever. And there were another 8 or 10 of these zip lines as you go through you hike a little bit, walk a little bit, zip line a lot, and then you're in it. And that came back to me in full listening to this conversation with Jerry because of that, as you say, that amygdala repetition that is required to kind of accustom yourself to these things. It's straight up terrifying just until the moment that it isn't.
Yeah. From self-waterboarding to human projectile, and suddenly these things are 2 of the most gorgeous experiences you can ever remember.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. It's amazing. The other thing he said that I thought was interesting, can I change to my second one? Or did you have more to say about that? All right. The second one was he talked about, he used the word mood a lot. And I'm fascinated by moods. And I think mood in context of like work and life is often disrespected or diminished to the point that it's no longer useful. And I was really appreciative of Jerry and his use of mood and mood as relates to or versus feeling. And there's a business writer and theorist named Fernando Flores who is really quite something. And he and his daughter actually have done a lot of work on mood in the business context. Like, how do you approach a meeting? Like, just because you walk into a conference room, if you're like scared because you're in a conference room doesn't mean you're any less scared or sad or whatever. Like, how do you approach and define the mood of your sort of context, whatever that may be, home, work, life, etc. And so it was interesting to hear Jerry talk about mood in your conversation because it's I think it's the first time we've had it brought up. And I was wondering what you thought about is references to that, and in particular, this mood versus feelings question. Do you see a difference? What is your experience?
Yeah, I've always thought that's a really interesting choice of words to describe feelings plus thoughts.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, who does that remind you of that we just talked to in the last couple of months? That's soma plus story equals state from Victoria Castle.
Victoria, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So really what he's talking about in a mood is kind of it's a state. It's more than just your thoughts, more than just your feelings or sensations. It's kind of the whole thing all put together. But the emphasis for him is on how the story changes the embodied experience, where it goes from, something that's fluid and mysterious and can flow through you and evaporate on the, quickly, to something that's muddy. And then if you work with that mud long enough, you can bake it into bricks, as I was saying in my way of thinking about it, that can last a lifetime. You can build incredible bricks around things. And eventually you get tired of the isolation all the bricks create. So then you start getting into distraction. And that's where we start moving toward what Victoria would call relief.
The question there becomes, and I think this is where Flores's writing comes into play, which is how do you use it, right? How do you impact sort of your day to day? Understand by becoming more aware of the mood, the state that you're in, and how do you create a practice out of influencing that? Because it's so easy to just get mired, like you say, is in those bricks, right? To build your own little stucco house of fear and concern and whatever. And what you really, when really what would serve you best is maybe a mood of curiosity, of provocation, of interest, of love and warmth and generosity, grace, right? But I think right now, in the current media and political landscape, it's hard not to get baked.
Well, he's laying out, something that by now is getting familiar to us. It's his own way of talking about the stuff my brother Ben talked about in episode 1, which is not getting stuck in our stories. That Ted talked about in his ways, that definitely came up with Victoria. And it's this idea of how do we stay alive in our bodies rather than jump into our heads as we experience life. Jerry was adding something new there that I thought was really helpful, which is to acknowledge some of the time, the way we think about stuff is helpful. Some of the time there really is a problem to solve. And some of the time there isn't. And even if there is, dissolving the problem is immensely faster than solving it. So we talked about that gentleman that I work with who's has been dealing with a phobia. It's now gone. It's just amazing. He's been for months just terrified of a day-to-day, everyday, totally normal activity that he has never experienced any danger around. But he's so terrified he could not function in that activity. Because he'd almost lost his wife and he hadn't cried about it yet.
Yeah.
So when we finally got him close enough to his grief and got there really just through following sensation, just staying in the body, and his brain would want to talk, and I'd say, yeah, but where do you feel that in your body? Oh, that makes sense, but where do you feel that in your body? And come on back again, just a minute. Did you notice how soon as you started to feel it again in your chest, you wanted to bounce out? Yeah, let's go back to the chest. What's going on there? And all of a sudden he got really sad. And he kept crying and apologizing and crying and wanting not to cry. And he's of a generation that especially doesn't want to cry. And when he could just stay with the feelings, which really are physical sensations more than anything. Like sadness is a tightness in the throat and a warmth and wetness in the eyes, and right, but all over the world, sadness is experienced physiologically pretty similarly. Same with anger, same with fear. If we can stay with that, something begins to happen. And what he's saying is, when we want to jump into stories to create a problem that we can solve, we take a very, very long way around. Now, sometimes there is genuinely something that also needs to be solved, or at least talked about. What I'm finding with years of working with Jerry's stuff, same with Ben or Victoria, is, but if you do the feeling part first, if you stay within sensations, something changes inside that makes the other part immensely more approachable and accessible. And it is a really, really useful model because there's a transformation that happens at the bottom where you finally drop into the... It's a scary feeling when you drop into full feeling, like big emotional stuff that starts to arise from the sensations. It really does feel alone, and it feels nowhere. There's a sort of... it feels a little like falling into a well or something.
Have you seen Soul yet?
Yes.
I mean, that's limbo, right? That metaphor, like the people who wrote that movie have been listening to you and Jerry.
You're right. Or maybe we just got a really, really early preview of a great movie. But yeah. And there is something amazing that happens when you begin to shift through it. Here would be an example. One gentleman I've been working with recently has been finding a lot of fear and jealousy coming up around being separated from his girlfriend. Nothing's really changed. They've been living in separate cities for some time, and it's been perfectly fine. But she's had occasion to interact with a guy, locally for her, that has got him really scared. And it kept turning into a story about her and the other person that, when he had a chance to go visit and check out, turned out to not be the story.
Yeah.
And yet his brain can go that fast back into, but it is.
Yeah.
I mean, he already knows for sure there's no way in the world this guy is a romantic interest to.
But I'll bet
his
15
girlfriend.
minutes after he got on the plane leaving his girlfriend, he's already back into that story.
All she has to do is go on a study break. But when he's by himself again and the fear starts, the fear doesn't know where to go, so it turns into a story. Right? And what's been really helpful is to get to stay with the sensation long enough to realize, oh, this has to do with old shameful feelings about me.
Yeah.
I mean, about himself, that go back to really important things that really make sense, that he's never said out loud to anybody. And so, of course, it has to turn into a story about something out there instead of, I got to sit with this. And he's been doing beautiful work with that.
Yeah.
So there's something there about Jerry's stuff that's really amazing.
I was reflecting a little bit on, the gap that happens once you get through the sort of dissolution of the immediate trauma or the story, and how that the disconnect between sort of head and body, right? The disconnect of the soma part, the somatic elements. There is it's like amputees who deal with missing limbs syndrome, right? It's like we become so accustomed to the trauma that even when we don't feel the emotional weight of it, we miss that it was there. That we still resonate with the trauma, even though we've already kind of moved through it. It's still there's an echo. Like resolving those echoes is like the journey of resolving to some state of normalcy. Yeah, and I really like that image.
Yes, and And it does require the kind of repetition Jerry's talking about.
Yeah.
And there are two things he's willing to do that most people are not willing to do, and I find them both really amazing. Two things stood out to me as I was listening to that episode again. One of them is the piece you highlighted, which is his willingness to go repeat a difficult experience, knowing
amazing.
this is going to take a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Which starts with this idea of, in all the eons of humanity, love has never conquered fear and fear has never conquered love. We are supposed to live in a dynamic tension between them. And, sadness and anger and loneliness and, powerlessness, these are all sort of variations on this theme of fear. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, I'm never going to beat it. It'll always come around again in some way, but I can transform it.
Sure.
And I can live in a way so that I am less and less afraid. But it's going to take a lot of repetition because my amygdala won't respond to an explanation. So when he sits with a client, as you may have caught him alluding to, he'll say, well, I'd like to help you be scared.
Yeah.
Which is very confusing to people.
Yeah.
And then you could hear, as you pointed out beautifully, like, he's got a fear of heights. He's on vacation. Really? He's going to look at parasailing and think,
I'm going to confront something hard right now, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
how
Jerry,
was it?
It's my tie time.
I know. And somebody asks, how was it? And he's like, I have no idea. I wasn't there. I guess I'm going to have to do this again. It's amazing. I mean, that's such courage. The other thing I caught was in the exercise at the end when he said, and if you find you've gotten distracted and a thought has come up, stop. At that point, I was like, wait, what? And he was saying, once you've scared your amygdala, it's telling you that's as far as I want to go today.
Yeah.
You need to stop. And the two work beautifully together.
Yeah.
Stopping right there is not going to work very well unless you're going to go back and do it again.
Right.
But doing it again and again and again, if you keep terrifying yourself, isn't going to work very well either.
It's torture.
Because what your amygdala didn't have the first time it got scared was a chance to say, that's enough.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it wouldn't have been traumatized.
Yeah, that's fascinating, that the sort of dance between courage and kindness. Like, how easy is it to put on, like, the sort of mantle of machismo and say, I'm going to conquer my fear, and do it until you're just burned with just the hostility and have demonstrated no act of compassion to yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and we imagine we're going to grow faster that way.
Yeah.
At some point, we'll find a cool way to do a show about this, but Ted taught me years ago about a different way to exercise, which is really fascinating. The idea is when we are breathing through our noses, we tend to breathe from the diaphragm, and we tend to stay in a parasympathetic, that is a relaxed, restorative place. Mm-hmm. Once we start breathing through our mouths, we tend to breathe up in our chest, and our body starts preparing for an emergency. Generally, when everything's working great, at least before we got to this culture where we're halfway into crisis all the time, we would only breathe through our noses, believe it or not. Unless we were running from something or chasing something. And then we'd breathe through our mouths because we needed like that extra turbo boost of, adrenaline, and the breathing through the mouth would stimulate it. So the idea is when you're exercising, you exercise right to the limit where you no longer feel comfortable breathing through your nose.
Really?
And then you slow down a little bit.
So that you keep breathing through your nose.
Yeah. And if you have to, because you've overdone it or you're on a really steep hill and you have to stop to breathe, keep breathing through your nose too. And as soon as you can start moving again, but keep breathing through your nose, you do that too. If you find your mouth has opened, stop for a minute. As soon as you can breathe through your nose, start going again.
Okay. What does that do for you?
Well, it turns out it's apparently really, really good for you. And that your exercise gains are really rapid this way because body doesn't go into a fight or flight state, not even a little bit. Martina Navratilova, the famous tennis player who not only was, a superstar of her time, but has by far the longest tennis career ever recorded. She, I think, won a doubles tournament at Wimbledon in her 50s. And she was trained that way. When she was young, her coach would stop the point every time she started breathing through her mouth. Wow. And she credits that to long-term kind of, resilience and kind of healthier living and sort of body through her career. I didn't say that very well, but I think you got the idea.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
So I bring all that up to say, Jerry, in a sense, does that emotionally. He's so much like Ted. They are two of the gentlest humans I've ever encountered, and they're really, really patient with people. And you've probably heard me say somewhere along the way in these shows, the slower you go, the faster you get there.
Yeah,
I'll say it 1,000 more times because it's just one of the great paradoxes ever. And they live that so well. And one of the ones I'd never noticed before is if I am with my feelings and I jump to my thoughts, that's an okay time to stop. I've always thought, well, shoot, I go there so freaking fast that I'll never get anything done. I got to power back in, really commit, force myself into my feelings, which is not the idea.
I do that all the time.
I know.
All the time.
And as the co-host of the ADHD podcast, I wonder what you think about that. But what if a big chunk of ADHD isn't just you're just wired that way, you couldn't possibly help it, but that you got wired that way early through some way of interacting with your experience that drove you to change the subject as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big what if. But,
yeah,
I guess I look at it the other way. Making a practice of this stuff, making a practice of, breathing through your emotional nose is I think might end up being a really interesting salve to the experience of fireworks brain, right?
Yeah.
Being able to really sit back on the lawn and enjoy it rather than just feeling like you're up in the middle of it. And that's an experience I have all the time. And when it comes to productivity and business stress and all these kinds of things that I struggle with that end up flashing as distractions, right? The act of just sort of mulling them and never being able to sort of sit back and shut off the feeling of why am I so persistently thinking about the most negative outcomes that could possibly befall the projects that I'm working on?
Yeah.
Being able to exist in the state immediately before the mulling over might be a nice space to live in for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that even better than the origin question is so how could I use this to help myself notice when my brain has kicked back in and it's changing the subject or has begun to loop on something? And maybe the useful question would be, I wonder if I just got scared. And if so, where do I feel that in my body?
Yeah.
Could I stay with it for a little while? Maybe just long enough before I, until I get distracted. I have a feeling often, one big hallmark of ADHD is a wonderful capacity for hyperfocus. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be the kind of thing where you could just follow those sensations until you realized, I think that was enough. Mm-hmm. I like his 3 F's, Jerry's, that is. Yeah.
Find, focus, and follow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Find the fear, focus on the experience, and follow the sensation. Is that how he was talking about?
Yeah,
that?
essentially. So you're finding the sensation. You're focusing on it until it gets it intensifies and magnifies. And then you're following it as it becomes something new. Mm-hmm. It may diminish, it may get bigger, it may transform, it may move to somewhere else in the body. And you follow it, and then you find that, and you focus on that until it becomes what it needs to be, and then you follow it to where it goes next. Until you find either a thought has come in, which means that's enough, or is transformed entirely and you feel free.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot. I like that because it's just, he's such a playful guy with words and so thoughtful that all of these mnemonic devices are easy to kind of track. Reading his reviews, and he and I were texting yesterday about some other issues and related to the show, and in his words, I'm as off the grid as anyone can possibly be. Like, he has there's no website, there's nothing to point anybody to about him. He's got, a phone number. But he does have, because he's a licensed practitioner in the state of Nashville, there are all of the various sites, the like Rate My Doc sites and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And one of the common threads that you see with Jerry is that he is a therapist's therapist, and not meaning that he is like a pinnacle of the therapeutic community, although he is very well maybe. He's a great contributor. But the fact is that he has a reputation of being a great therapist for other therapists.
Yes.
That's a thing that kind of stuck with me, and specifically as you are a therapist who has been working with Jerry, can you reflect a little bit on your experience as of working with a great therapist as a client?
Yeah. Well, he's... I was referred to him for exactly that purpose. That and one other thing. I had asked my supervisor a million years ago, I need like the best therapist you can think of. And he said, well, I got a few people in mind. And when he brought up Jerry, he said, now he would be a different cat because he's going to spend a lot of time talking about your body, which is not really where I come from. And I was like, that's my man. Yeah. Because I didn't know about that back then.
I want to go to there.
Yeah. I need somebody to get me out of my head and my words because they will otherwise drown me.
Sure.
Right? And, working with Jerry, we had the same conversation 1,000 times. Very often I'd come in and I would tell a big story, and then I'd say, God, I don't know what to do about that. And he would look at me with the same patient, slightly sort of amused glimmer in his eye, and he would cock his head a little bit, and he would always say, do?
Okay, Yoda.
Like, Jesus. It's like been 12 years and I still fall for it every time. Like every time I think I'm supposed to do something, and every time he would say, do? And then I go, God dang it. Here I went again. I mean, like, right? I've already taught 1,000 clients to go past me in that way. But, at one point I was really frustrated about it, of just how long it was taking for me to get anywhere. And he said, oh, Dodge, you're a therapist. You're making record time. And I was like, oh, man. What do you mean? And he was like, therapists are the absolute slowest moving clients of all time. They think of themselves as terribly willing, but they have got the best stories in the world to wrap around their feelings. Trying to extricate them from those stories just takes a very long time.
But I guess it's like anything else. This is so funny because, I've been podcasting a very long time, and I have some ingrained belief systems around the things, processes, workflows, tools that I use that are intractable. And I know that about myself, but that means it's 1,000 times harder to implement change on a day-to-day kind of process level. I just don't change easily because I believe that what I'm doing is the best way to do it, even though it's totally not. And I have to imagine, that's kind of the same thing, right? Except for you're living very much in your podcasting tool all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really interesting process. And you're exactly right. And it becomes really tempting to go into, my training, sort of back into the family system, back into the psyche, back into the unconscious, back into sort of any of the places I was trained like that. And, you know, he was always just kind of like, meh, who knows about that? I'd be really interested in just where that is in your body right now.
Yeah, sure.
And then I'd stay with that for a little while. And often what was really cool was if I started with that and I spontaneously ended up in something that felt like old history, that was productive. If I went looking for an explanation in ancient history, I could keep myself busy for weeks or months on that and not really get anywhere.
Yeah, sure.
And if anybody's interested in a great example of that, that happened with my brother in that first episode. He started asking me to just notice my experience, right?
Yeah.
And as I did that, I just could hear Jerry sort of right on my right shoulder, guiding me kind of into my body. And so you'll hear, I answer Ben with an early answer is just, I noticed that in my physical self, which gave rise all of a sudden to a, why do I feel 8 years old? Holy crap. I remember when I was 8 years old, what was going on. And that was super productive right on the spot. I mean, 5 minutes of therapy and that was, you know, years of work. Bam, right like that. It's a beautiful way. But in a sense, you could hear me. I mean, if you go back and listen to that episode, you can hear me like begin to attend to my experience, get out of my head. Even the memories I'm coming to, I'm just channeling back into my body, though you may not hear me do it out loud. And about the time the tears are hitting, I'm getting to the bottom of that spot Jerry talks about, where you're down into alone and nowhere and nothing.
As something is dissolving.
Something's dissolving. And it's suddenly putting it together. Wham. And the problem is, for eons, good therapists have guided people to a place where spontaneously what comes up is that memory. And then something absolutely beautiful happens, like you could hear in that episode happening for me. And then all these therapists to follow have thought, oh, I guess the idea is go find the memory.
Right. But
and not wait for it to come up by itself.
Sure.
But if you do it the other way, you can hear there's sort of that beautiful sadness on the other side and the recognition that comes with it and a kind of freedom. Like, it's a pretty cool example of it happening in real time.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yep.
I'd forgotten about that. That was a great sort of bearing witness to the Jerry experience with your brother. That was really special.
Yeah. It's really been kind of cool actually all year long to look back on that episode because it's one of the few where things get like especially raw, especially for me, right? You went there in another episode, but like that in that moment, I'm there and we're getting an example of lots of the things we hear about later.
Yeah, sure.
Other guests have come and talked about elements of that very session with my brother.
Yeah. Well, this was a great experience with Jerry. I think he's a really special dude, and I'm so glad we were able to wrangle him on here.
Yeah, me too. Really fortunate, and what a huge blessing to have had a teacher like that in my life.
Truly.
Like long after he was, you know, a therapist for especially pressing needs a whole lot of years ago, he just was an amazing model and example and consultant and supervisor in a sense. I mean, I could just bring in my stuff and the therapist in me is sitting on my own shoulder listening to him work with the dude. Yep.
Pretty special guy.
Yeah. Lucky.
Well.
All right, man.
Yeah. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you.
See you next week. Love you.